Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Reopening UAG second family meeting. For those of you who were able to join us live, thank you. And for those of you who weren't, this is what this is for. Our agenda for today, we're going to talk about updated numbers. We'll discuss our entry and screening protocols. We will talk about the test and trace procedures, and I will share what we are thinking currently for our tentative schedule for fall 2020, and then some Q&A at the end. Okay, so I know this looks overwhelming. Lots of numbers, a pie chart, a lot of information, lots of percentages. Don't worry, I'm going to simplify this. So we are really bound by the numbers. How many staff and students we have in person versus remote will really determine the schedule that we have for next year. The number of staff that we have approved for accommodations and the number of students that we have in person will also determine if UAG teachers will be able to teach the remote students as well. So we don't have any of that information concretely until I believe it's the end of August. And so right now, a lot of this is speculation. We did do our own survey. And so we had a great response rate. 328 families responded out of 465. And so based on what we asked parents, this is the data that we have. About 60% will send their student to school for sure. And that's this combined blue and red, that there's some parents that would love to send their kids every day if possible. Now, 20% of parents said they're on the fence, they might send their child. And to be exact, 22.8 said that there's no way they're sending their kid to school, they're doing fully remote. And so based on these numbers, there is a chance that we will have 80% of our students in the hybrid model. We also asked some important questions about preferences for schedule, in terms of how kids are feeling about returning to school. And I did want to share this with you because this is an important factor in determining our schedule. Unfortunately, 25%, actually 24%, so about a quarter of families experience loss during this time. And about half of our kids are feeling nervous about safety when returning to school. The reason this is important is we will have to provide trauma-informed instruction. We will have to address the loss. We will have to help students as they transition back to school. We will have to be able to support them in so many ways emotionally, and socially and academically. And so there needs to be time in the schedule to do this. In terms of alternating days versus alternating weeks, most parents preferred the alternating days schedule. Now I'm going to speak to you about the safety measures. We're going to start with entry and the lining up protocol. So every single school is going to have their own entrance and is going to use their own staircase or escalator. And so this is something we decided as a building council. We really want to keep the schools separate to avoid congestion and avoid large gatherings. So UAG and BOSS are going to be the only two schools that are going to be using the escalators. And of course, that's because we're on the higher floors. We are going to enter through the main entrance, as will BOSS. BOSS is going to enter on the left-hand side, closer to the gym, and we're going to enter on the right-hand side, closer to the yard. And the distance between those two lines is about 25 feet. We're going to put some markers on the floor to indicate spacing of 6 feet apart, and they're going to extend out onto the street. Staff is going to be stationed outside to remind students to socially distance, to help direct them, and to also remind them to put on their face masks or distribute face masks to students that don't have them. We want to make sure to take care of all of this outside in the fresh air before students are coming into the building. Once you get to the front of the doors of the building, this is where kids are going to be scanning in. So when I say scanning in, this means logging their attendance. So usually kids will scan their ID card inside the building and then proceed to their classes. This will look a little different. We're going to put the cast towards the front of the door, and they're not going to be actually scanning. They're just going to be saying their ID number, and one person will enter their ID number. There has been some conversation about students and staff needing to use an app at home to log that they're symptom-free and temperature is normal. So staff will be doing this. We don't know yet about students. So if this is the case, if students are doing the same pre-screening app at home, then when they come to the front of the building, they're also going to share the green check from their app to show that they've been cleared. Some students will have a random temperature checks. If their temperature is 100.4 or higher, they will be sent to the isolation room, um, and they will wait until their parents come to pick them up. So the isolation room is going to be the auditorium. The reason we're using the auditorium is there's a separate entrance for it, so we don't have to worry about kids traveling through the whole building that might be sick. We're also using the auditorium because it's a very, very large space. It can hold 700 kids, and so it's the perfect space for socially distancing any kids with a fever or with symptoms. It also has an HVAC system so that we know that the filtration is much better in the auditorium. And when parents come to pick students up, they don't even have to come into the building. They can stand outside on the plaza deck right by the auditorium entrance. Oh, and lastly, the auditorium is right next to the second floor nurses station. So again, avoiding lots of travel time. Once students have scanned in or given their ID number, they are going to proceed to side C. So that's for UAG. That's the side that's closest to the cafeteria, and they'll either go up the stairs or go up the escalator. Someone will be stationed there to hold students to make sure that they're coming up in intervals as opposed to all coming up together. So this is the pre-screening app that I spoke about. This is what it looks like for a staff member. So I logged in with my name so you guys can see it. So when you log in, it just tells you this is the health screening app. You sign in for a DOE employee, and then you get 3 questions. One asks about if you've had a fever or shortness of breath, a new cough in the past 10 days, if you've gotten a positive test result in the past 10 days, or if you've been in contact with someone who's had COVID-19 symptoms or has had a confirmed COVID-19 test result in the last 14 days. And so I submitted no on all of these, and then this is the green check that gives me clearance to enter the building. And so the thought is it would be the same for students if they implement it. Now, if you notice on the side, on the bottom, it actually had an option for guest screening for visitors and families. And so this is what it would look like for a guest. Another thing that we talked about with our campus is our policy around visitors. So we all agreed that we're limiting visitors to absolutely necessary. So visitors can only come alone, they can't bring friends, they can't bring family members. It's only must visit in person. If possible, we're going to try to do all our meetings remotely. Prior to visiting, the person would fill out the health screening app as well, and this includes parents. And if not complete, then they would have their temperature taken on the spot. We're going to ask them to provide all their contact information for tracing purposes, and of course, they will need to wear a mask. If possible, we're going to try to have that meeting in the cafeteria, which is right on the first floor. It prevents from the need of whoever's visiting to go up the stairs, up the elevator, through other floors. That way they just walk in, have the meeting there, and then they can leave. If necessary to go up to the individual schools, then a staff member from that school will come down and escort the visitor to the exact place that they have their meeting. This way we avoid visitors potentially going into areas that they're not supposed to be going into. It avoids having them get lost or roaming around the building. And again, as a reminder, parents who are picking up any kids who are sick will actually wait outside on the plaza by the entrance of, to the auditorium where their kid will be brought out. Something that we discussed at our last meeting was the requirement for masks. Students who do not wear their mask will have to go home and be picked up by their parents as well. And so same process, they will wait on the side for their child to be brought out. Several of you reached out to me after the mayor's and chancellor's announcement around testing for some clarification. A lot of you weren't sure, is this mandatory testing? Is this voluntary? How many people are being tested? How will the results be shared? So there's currently no plans to mandate the testing for staff or students. As of right now, all school-based staff, and that means anyone who's inside a school building, so teachers, guidance counselors, school aides, are encouraged to get tested 7 days in advance of in-person reopening. at one of the 34 city-run locations. And the reason that they're being asked to test at the city-run locations is they will have priority for testing, and that means that they're expected to get their results in 24 to 48 hours. All school-based staff is also encouraged to sign up for random monthly testing. But I do want to be clear, this is not a mandate, this is a recommendation. There also has not been a requirement for a certain number of staff to be tested from each building or from each school. There's also no way for us to know if staff has volunteered to do the testing or not as of right now. And there has not been any indication of priority testing for students. That was another question that I got from a parent. When the mayor and the chancellor spoke on TV about contact tracing, they had mentioned that if there's a positive test result, the classroom will be quarantined and the classroom will be closed. And in an elementary model, it's very clear what the classroom represents, but it's a little unclear on the high school level. And so this is why I think it's important for us to explain how UAG is going to be handling contact tracing. So we're going to try to keep our kids together as much as possible, meaning that the same 12 to 15 kids would have the exact same teachers, would have the exact same classes, would have the exact same schedule. Our hope is to keep the contact cohorts at a max of 30, but ideally 15. And so I just want to be clear, a contact cohort is not your class. It's not the class size. Our class size will be 12 to 15. What a contact cohort is basically the cohort of kids that you've had a class with. And so while it is ideal that you would have the same classes all day with the same kids, there is a possibility because kids are at different math levels, kids are in different tech pathways, that there might be a need, third period, let's say, for half the kids to go to one class and half the kids to go to another math class. And so that would mean that two cohorts would commingle, creating a contact cohort of 30. And so the reason that contact cohort is important to keep track of is anyone that you've had sustained contact with is important to know if there's a positive COVID test. So what happens when there's a positive COVID test? The contact cohort will be quarantined for 14 days. So that's what we're interpreting the classroom to mean. The test and trace contact tracing will interview staff to verify level of contacts with the confirmed case. And everyone in that cohort is going to shift to 100% remote learning, including the teachers. So that means that that teacher who might have been teaching in person might now teach online. And so anyone who has that teacher, it would shift to remote learning. Many of you asked, will you let us know who tested positive? So what will happen is any families of students who have confirmed close contact with the positive COVID-19 tested individual will be notified that they've had close contact. And everyone else will just be notified that there is a confirmed case of COVID-19 at the school, but they're not considered a close contact. We're not going to tell you who the student or the staff member is, of course, to maintain privacy. Once there is a confirmed positive COVID-19 test in the building, what happens next really depends on if you've had contact with the individual and if it was close contact. So if you've had no close contact with the individual, then you can return to school once you have a negative COVID-19 test and clearance from the healthcare provider, and you've been symptom-free for 24 hours without the use of medication. So this is for students. Staff can opt to return right away. If you've been part of the close cohort, then you will be expected to quarantine for 14 days since your last exposure to the individual with the case. You will also have to present a negative COVID-19 test after that 14-day quarantine, as well as clearance from your healthcare provider, and have to be symptom-free for 24 hours without the use of medication. And the same applies for staff. There was conversation in terms of what happens if the individual cannot get tested. According to the guidance that was given by the Department of Education, if the student does not get tested, then the student or staff member cannot return to school until 10 days have passed since their first symptom, and the student has been symptom-free for 24 hours without the use of medication. This information is going to be stored and recorded so we can really track when students began quarantining, so we can know when to allow them back in. And so this is the system that was developed by the Department of Education. It's the COVID tracking system. I took a screenshot of it. Of course, right now everything's at 0 because we haven't reopened, but this is what the system will look like. Now, this is not a public system. No one has access to it. I'm the only one with access to it. Many of you emailed me asking about under what circumstances would the school close. Some of you mentioned there's other schools in the building. And so when we're talking about closing a school, are we closing the school or are we closing the building? And so I tried to simplify it again in a chart. I know it might not seem that simple, but the idea is this, that if the confirmed positive test results are within one contact cohort, then that cohort would quarantine for 14 days, and anyone in close contact with them would quarantine for 14 days, but the school building will remain open. Now, if there's 2 or more cases and they're not in the same contact cohort, and so that would mean if there's one case at one school and one case in another school, then the school building would close and transition to remote learning for 24 hours. An investigation would be done, and as soon as the investigation is complete, everyone will return to the building, or at least anyone who's cleared to return to the building will. If there's a chance that these cases are unable to be determined in terms of tracing, so like it's unclear where the link is, or it's not clear who this person has had contact with, then the entire school building would close for 14 days. So let's say there's been one case in each of the schools. We can't figure out who the confirmed, and when I say we, it's going to be a test and trace team, it's not the school, but the test and trace team cannot figure out who this individual has been in contact with, what route they took, what room they were in. That would be a case under which the link is unable to be determined and the school building would close for 14 days. And again, everyone returns to the building based on these regulations. Another circumstance under which the entire building would close would be based on the positive test results in New York City. And what the mayor said is, if the percentage of positive test results in New York City are equal to or more than 3% using the 7-day rolling average, then everyone shifts to remote learning. As I mentioned at the start of this video, our schedule is going to be determined by the numbers. And so it'll be determined by how many kids we have in person versus how many teachers we have in person, versus which students are in person. And so this is just a tentative schedule that we've been thinking of. It is not the final schedule. I want to be clear. I did just want to share with you what we're leaning towards. So as you're making your decision by August 7th, you have a little bit more information. So we're leaning towards the chancellor's recommended model of 1A. And so there will be 3 cohorts of students. One cohort is going to be the red cohort, which will come in on red days. The second cohort will be the gray cohort, which will come in on gray days. And then there's going to be the all remote cohort, which will not report to school and do 100% of their learning online. The red cohort will come in Mondays, Thursdays, and alternating Wednesdays, and the gray cohort will come in Tuesday, Friday, and alternating Wednesdays. And so this way we'll still keep the UAG mantra of what day is it? Is it red or gray? And so the schedule would look like this. Hypothetically, these are some mock schedules for 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. One of the things I want to point out is there's a block in the middle of the day that looks a little bit longer. So all the classes are 45 minutes, except for this class, it has an extra 30 minutes. And so the question came up of like, why is this class longer? If you recall in the beginning, I had mentioned that about a quarter of our students had experienced loss, that more than half of our students are afraid about transitioning back to school. And so we want to make sure that we set aside dedicated time to connect with kids, to deal with the trauma that they're experiencing, to engage in some of the work around trauma-informed instruction. And so we are setting a dedicated 30-minute block every single day. And that block will be dedicated for all students in remote learning as well as in person. And so that is going to be during this 4th period, where it'll be 10:45 to 12. We are still gonna maintain our gold. So at the end of the day at 1:30, from 1:30 to 2 is when we will have gold. Um, this is also when we're planning on our lunch. And so the thought is gold is at the end of the day, lunch is at the end of the day. Kids will receive a bagged lunch and leave with the lunch. We want to try to avoid having food in the classroom, and avoid having kids together with their masks off eating. Um, this way, kids will grab their lunch, go, and they can eat outside. This will also allow us to stagger our dismissal a little bit. So not all kids will be leaving at 1:30. Some will leave at 1:30, and then the kids who have gold will leave at 2. Some of the questions that came up a lot, will snacking in class be allowed? Will some of the classes be remote? Will we still rotate classes like A period, B period, C period? What if I want to switch cohorts? Like I said, why is there a quarantine block? And so I recognize that you have all these questions. Believe me, this is just 5 questions. There's probably hundreds, but we are working through all of the logistics right now. I will say so much of this is determined by the numbers. And so we will try to accommodate you as much as possible in terms of, days of the week that your child comes in because of childcare issues, but it may not always be possible, to switch the day that you're assigned, because you will be assigned a day based on, the classes that you need. And so there's a chance that, for example, AP Calculus is only offered on red days. And so that's why you have to be part of the red cohort. So again, this is just a mock schedule. Um, this is not the final schedule, but this is sort of what we're thinking of right now. The other reason that we chose this schedule is it allows us to end our day a little bit earlier. That way, we'll be having dismissal at a completely different time from all the other schools. All the other schools in the building and around the area are having their dismissal at around 2:30 or later. The flip of that is, what does a remote schedule look like? Many parents have asked, will my kid in remote learning have a very similar schedule, like first period from 8:30 to 9:15, second period from 9:15 to 10 a.m. Will it be like that? And so I have to be honest and say, most likely it will not. It is not going to be feasible to have enough teachers, to run that sort of schedule, um, every single period online and every single period in person. The only way that that would be possible is if we live stream our classes. So that's the schedule on the right. So if we live stream all of our classes and everyone's hooked up to a camera, sure, we could do that. But the more likely scenario will be, the sample day on the left, where assignments will be posted on Google Classroom. There's going to be a time for asynchronous learning. Asynchronous learning means that students do it at their own pace, on their own time. So it's like independent work. And then there will be a block of synchronous learning. Synchronous learning means that a specific time learning is happening. It might be, through live stream classes, or it might be, through a Zoom. And then we will definitely have gold for students who are remote. And then there will also be that quarantine, 30-minute social emotional learning time. I know many of you said you wanted to know the final plan for UAG, and the final schedule that is going to happen, and if UAG teachers are 100% going to be teaching the kids who are doing remote learning before you make a decision, whether to sign up your child for remote learning or keep them hybrid. But unfortunately, the reality is we won't be able to give you that information. I wanted to give you as much as we could, based on what we know thus far, to give you a sample schedule that we're thinking of, to give you what it might look like for remote learning. But unfortunately, until we have the final numbers and the exact names of kids that will be hybrid versus remote, we won't be able to determine a final schedule. So this is just sort of our thinking, where we've been going thus far. Um, Again, as a reminder, please, 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 fill out this form by August 7th if you're planning on keeping your child for remote learning. The more information that we have, the easier it will be to plan, and the quicker we can get that information to you as well. Now, many of you might still have questions. I still have questions myself. Please, if you have any questions, email them to me. I work really hard to try to get the answers to all of your questions. I may not always be able to, but I will address as many as I can. I know you can't really ask live questions during a recording, but I will share some questions that folks asked, um, at the other session or have emailed me since the session. We did get a lot of questions around PSAL sports, ROTC, and extracurricular activities. We will still have extracurricular activities. We will still have some clubs, both remote and in person. PSAL sports, meaning the Public School Athletic League, as well as any competitive sports, as of right now, are canceled for the fall. So as of right now, there are no sports for the fall. However, we are coming up with some alternate ideas for that to, you know, feed the need for competition at UAG. In terms of ROTC will continue, but it will be continuing online. So there will be a remote ROTC option. Another question that came up was around, let me go back to it, was around this schedule. And the question of like, what do you mean by alternating Wednesdays? So what we mean by alternating Wednesdays is, let's say during week 1, if you're a red cohort, you might have class on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. But on week 2, if you're the red cohort, you only have class on Monday, Thursday in person. Again, when you are not in person, you are still learning, but that learning is happening online. Another question that came up was around students with IEPs and how their needs would be met in a remote setting. So our special education team in the beginning of the year is going to work through all the IEPs and creating remote learning plans for all of our students. Now remember, no matter what, whether you're in person or remote, you're going to have some sort of remote learning that you will have to do. And so our special education team will work to develop remote learning plans for all of our students with IEPs. So they're still having their needs met in a remote setting. And it's going to look different for everyone. So what that will look like in action will be dependent on the needs of your child. I received a few questions about uniforms. I never thought that you would like uniforms so much to be asking about them. As I mentioned previously, for this year, the most important thing is that kids are wearing their masks, not wearing their UAG shirt. We are in the process of getting our school store and our uniform store back online so you can order UAG swag if you want to. But as of right now, we are not mandating a uniform other than a face mask. And yes, we do have UAG branded face masks that we will be giving out. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for emailing your questions. Thank you just for emailing us and giving us feedback. I want you guys to know that we're working really, really hard to make sure that when we reopen in September, it is the safest reopening possible in New York City. UAG is a family, and we're going to do everything we could to protect our family. That's the UAG way. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day or evening, depending on when you're tuning in.